There is a question on a government form that arrives at your door every 10 years, and it looks harmless. It asks you to pick a box: white, black, or African American, American Indian. And you check one or several, and you move on because a box is just a box. Except that in 1790, the first time this country counted its people, there were only 3 categories that mattered, and none of them asked your opinion. In 1890, there were 8 racial categories, including 2 words, quadroon and octoroon, that most Americans alive today have never heard spoken aloud. In 1930, an entirely new race appeared on the form, existed for exactly 1 census, and then vanished quietly after a foreign government complained. And in Virginia, across the 1920s and 30s, a single state official used the logic of those boxes to erase 2 entire peoples from the paper record. No arrests, no trials, not 1 shot fired. Just a registrar, a filing cabinet, and a list of surnames. Here is the part that should stop you. The census is not a mirror. It has never been a mirror. It is an instrument, written and rewritten every decade by people with specific interests, and for most of American history, the person who decided what race you were was not you. It was a stranger standing on your porch with a pencil, following instructions you were never shown, and the box that stranger checked determined how many congressmen your state received, how much federal money flowed toward your county, whether your marriage was legal, and in at least 1 documented case during the Second World War, whether the government could find your family by neighborhood. That wartime episode, by the way, is one the Census Bureau itself did not fully acknowledge for roughly 60 years, and I am going to walk you through exactly what happened, because the way it happened is the way it could happen again. Here is what this episode will actually show you. First, the story of Walter Plecker, the Virginia registrar who spent 34 years reclassifying living people on paper, down to the specific 1943 letter in which he compared his own record-keeping favorably to Nazi Germany's in his own words. Second, the mechanism, the reason that for roughly 170 years your race on the census was assigned by observation, and the exact decade that finally changed. Third, the racial category that existed for 1 census only, 1930, the roughly 1.4 million people it counted, and the diplomatic pressure that killed it. Fourth, what census information did in 1942 and 1943 according to the 2 historians who spent years reconstructing it from Bureau archives. And fifth, what the boxes are worth right now in dollars, including the estimate from researchers at George Washington University that puts the annual figure around $1.5 trillion, and the 72-year rule that lets you pull your own family's file and read what a stranger decided they were. A quick word on method, because this channel does not ask you to take anything on faith. Everything in this episode comes from the census schedules themselves, from the enumerator instructions the Census Bureau published each decade, and from the work of named historians and demographers. Where the record is contested, or where figures are estimates, I will say so plainly. Start in Richmond, Virginia in 1912. A physician named Walter Plecker takes over as the first registrar of Virginia's new Bureau of Vital Statistics, the office that records every birth, marriage, and death in the state. He will hold that job for 34 years, until 1946, and in that time he will conduct what tribal historians and scholars now commonly call a paper genocide. Understand who this man was and who stood behind him, because he did not act alone. Plecker was allied with the Anglo-Saxon Clubs of America, a eugenicist organization co-founded in Richmond in 1922 by the concert pianist John Powell and the white supremacist writer Ernest Sevier Cox, and together they lobbied the legislation into existence that Plecker would then weaponize. In 1924, Virginia passes the Racial Integrity Act, a law that recognizes only 2 racial categories for vital records, white and colored, and defines white so narrowly that a single non-white ancestor disqualifies you, with one carefully carved exception written directly into the statute. for persons with 1/16 or less American Indian blood, an exception the legislature added because some of Virginia's proudest first families claimed descent from Pocahontas and John Rolfe, and the law of the Moy. That same year, 1924, Virginia also passed the involuntary sterilization law that the United States Supreme Court would uphold in Buck v. Bell in 1927. This was one intellectual project with multiple instruments, and Plecker held the paperwork instrument. He is the Racial Integrity Act's chief enforcer, and he has a specific obsession. He does not believe Virginia's Indian tribes still exist. He is convinced, and he writes this repeatedly in official correspondence, that the people calling themselves Monacan, Chickahominy, Rappahannock, Pamunkey, and Mattapony are, in his view, people of mixed black ancestry attempting to reclassify themselves. So he acts. His office alters birth certificates, sometimes by literally annotating them with warnings that the racial claim is false. It flags marriage licenses, and under the act, marrying across the color line Plecker policed was a felony punishable by 1 to 5 years in the penitentiary. It sends local registrars, clerks, and midwives lists of specific family surnames, county by county, with instructions that children born to those families are not to be recorded as Indian, and midwives who defied the instruction were threatened with prosecution and prison time. One of his circulars, sent in January of 1943 to every local registrar and clerk in the state, listed the suspects' surnames by county, families named Branham and Johns in Amherst County, Adkins in Charles City County, Collins and Gibson elsewhere, ordinary names attached to living children whose legal identity was being rewritten before they could speak. And people fought him. As early as 1924, a young woman named Atha Sorrells of Amherst County sued after Plecker's office blocked her marriage license on the grounds that she was not white, and a Virginia judge ruled in her favor, openly doubting that anyone in Virginia could prove the purity the statute demanded. Plecker raged about the decision in his correspondence, and then simply kept going because the courtroom loss did not touch the filing cabinet. In a letter from January of 1943 that survives in the archives and is quoted in essentially every serious account of this period, Plecker writes that his office has made a study of the mixed-race families of Virginia, and he adds in his own words that Hitler's genealogical study of the Jews is not more complete. He wrote that sentence with pride in the middle of the Second World War, while American soldiers were fighting the regime he was citing as a benchmark. Think about what a birth certificate is. It is the root document of a legal life. If the state changes the words on that one piece of paper, then the school you may attend changes, and Monacan children in Amherst County were in fact shut out of white schools and Indian classification alike, left with a small mission school as their only option. The person you may legally marry changes. Your draft classification changes, and during the war, Virginia Indian men were classified for induction according to Plecker's paperwork rather than their own identity, some refusing to serve in units that denied who they were. And, decades later, your tribe's ability to prove it continuously existed changes too. That last one matters enormously because federal recognition of a tribe depends heavily on documentary continuity, on showing an unbroken paper record of existence as a people, and Plecker had spent 3 decades salting the archive, replacing the word Indian with the word colored on the very documents recognition would one day require. When 6 of Virginia's tribes, the Chickahominy, the Eastern Chickahominy, the Upper Mattapony, the Rappahannock, the Nansemond, and the Monacan finally received federal recognition, it came in January of 2018 by an act of Congress, the Thomasina-Jordan Act, because the ordinary administrative pathway kept demanding the continuous documentation Plecker had destroyed. The Pamunkey had achieved recognition only 3 years earlier in 2015. Historians of the process have pointed to the damaged paper trail as one reason it took the better part of a century. And here is why I am opening with Plecker rather than treating him as a footnote. Plecker was not an aberration operating against the American system of racial accounting. He was that system operating with unusual energy. The categories, the reclassification, the idea that a clerk's pen defines what you are, none of that was invented in Richmond. It was learned from the Federal Ledger itself, and that ledger reaches back to the founding. So how did the machine actually work? In plain terms like this. From 1790 until 1960, the census did not ask you your race. An enumerator, a hired stranger, looked at you or at whoever answered the door and recorded a category based on written instructions that changed nearly every decade. Instructions the public generally never saw. The very first census in 1790 was carried out by federal marshals and their assistants riding district to district, and it returned a count of about 3.9 million people, a number both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson privately suspected was too low. Its structure was brutally simple: free white males divided by age 16 because the government wanted to know its military potential, free white females, all other free persons, and slaves. That last column existed because of Article 1 of the Constitution, the 3/5 clause, which counted an enslaved person as 3/5 of a person for purposes of allocating seats in the House of Representatives. Follow the incentive there for a moment, because it is the original sin of the whole system. Enslaved people could not vote, yet counting them inflated the congressional delegations and the electoral college votes of the states that enslaved them by roughly a dozen extra House seats in the early Republic. Historians such as Gary Wills have argued that this arithmetic was decisive in early national politics, and in his book on the subject, Wills makes the case that Thomas Jefferson won the presidential election of 1800 specifically because of the electoral votes generated by counting people who were held in bondage. Which is why Federalist newspapers of the era sneered at Jefferson as the Negro president, elected, in their words, on the backs of slaves he counted but did not free. From the very first count, in other words, the census was not simply describing the population, it was converting bodies into power, and the categories determined the exchange rate. Then the categories started multiplying, and they multiplied in step with the racial science of each era. In 1850, the schedule added mulatto, a change pushed in part by race scientists who wanted data to test their theory that people of mixed ancestry were biologically degenerate and short-lived, meaning a pseudo-scientific hypothesis was written directly into the national ledger as a checkbox. In 1890, enumerators were instructed to distinguish black, mulatto, quadroon, and octoroon, meaning they were expected to assess by sight on a doorstep whether a person was 1/4 or 1/8 of African descent. Even the Census Bureau later treated that data as close to worthless. And in a strange twist of archival fate, most of the 1890 schedules themselves were destroyed after a 1921 fire in the Commerce Department building, leaving a hole in the national record exactly where its most absurd categories had been. By 1930, the pendulum swung the other way, and the instructions codified what is commonly called the one-drop rule, directing that a person of mixed white and black ancestry be recorded as Negro no matter how small the fraction, while a person of mixed white and Indian ancestry was to be recorded as Indian unless the Indian portion was very small and the person was accepted as white in the community. Which means the form itself contains two different theories of race applied to different peoples in the same instruction booklet. Notice what this means in practice. The same living, breathing human being could be recorded as mulatto in 1880, black in 1900, and, if their appearance and neighborhood and surname read differently to a different enumerator, white in 1910, without ever moving, without ever signing anything, without ever being asked. Demographers who have linked individual people across census decades have documented exactly these silent migrations between categories in both directions. The sociologist Aaliyah Saperstein and her collaborator Andrew Penner have shown in modern longitudinal data that even interviewers today shift how they classify the same person depending on life circumstances, and in historical work, the economists Ricardo Dahis, Emily Nix, and Nancy Kian linked millions of individual records between 1880 and 1940 and estimated that hundreds of thousands of Black American men crossed into the white category in the census during their lifetimes, some permanently, some praktfik. An entire invisible migration conducted not across geography but across a column on a form. Race on the American ledger was not a fact about you. It was a decision about you, revised every 10 years. Only in 1960, when the census moved substantially to mailed forms that households filled out themselves, did self-identification become the norm. That is, within living memory. There are people watching this video who were first counted by a stranger's glance. And once you see that mechanism clearly, Plecker stops looking like a madman with a filing cabinet and starts looking like what he was. A man who understood, earlier and more cynically than most, that in America the paper is the person. Now let me give you 3 more cases, because Virginia was one theater in a much larger production. First, the category that lived and died inside a single decade. In 1930, for the first and only time, the census listed Mexican as a race. Enumerators were told to record persons of Mexican birth or parentage as Mexican unless they were, in the instructions words, definitely white, Negro, Indian, Chinese, or Japanese. The count came back at roughly 1.4 million people. Consider the timing. This was the opening of the Great Depression, and across the early 1930s, federal, state, and local authorities, along with private employers, carried out so-called repatriation drives that pressured or transported people of Mexican descent out of the country. In Los Angeles, the campaign opened with public spectacle, including a February 1931 raid on La Placita, the downtown plaza, where officers sealed the exits and demanded papers from everyone inside. The historians Francisco Balderrama and Raymond Rodriguez, in their book Decade of Betrayal, put the number of people removed or induced to leave as high as 1 million, and by their accounting roughly 60% were United States citizens, many of them children who boarded trains south to a country they had never seen. Other scholars put the figure lower, around 400,000, and I will give you the range rather than pretend to precision. But no serious account disputes that citizens were among the removed, and California formally apologized for its role by statute in 2005. I want to be careful and honest here. The census did not order those removals. But the 1930 schedule had done something quietly consequential. It had converted a community into a countable, mappable, separable population at the precise moment the political wind turned against them. And the community understood exactly what had happened. The government of Mexico lodged formal diplomatic objections to the classification. The League of United Latin American Citizens, founded in Corpus Christi in 1929, fought it as a legal demotion because in the segregated Southwest, being officially non-white meant Jim Crow's machinery could be turned your way. And when a Texas registrar tried in 1936 to classify Mexican Americans as colored on birth records, the backlash reached the State Department and the White House in an election year. By 1940, the category was gone, with persons of Mexican descent instructed to be counted as white. 1 decade, 1 box. Appearing and disappearing according to pressure, not biology. Second case, and this is the wartime episode I promised at the top. After Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 in February of 1942, and the following month Congress passed the Second War Powers Act, which stripped away the confidentiality protections that normally wall census answers off from the rest of the government. According to research by the historians Margot Anderson of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and William Seltzer of Fordham, who spent years in the Bureau's own archives, the Census Bureau then provided the War Department with small area data, down to the neighborhood and block level, showing where people of Japanese ancestry lived on the West Coast, and it provided that data with remarkable speed, in some cases within days of a request, because the 1940 count was wrecked and the tabulating machinery was ready. That data assisted the machinery of removal that ultimately incarcerated roughly 120,000 people of Japanese descent, about 2/3 of them American citizens, in camps from Manzanar to Hart Mountain. For decades, the Bureau's official position was that it had cooperated only in aggregate, only in statistics, never in individuals. Then, in 2000, Census Bureau Director Kenneth Prewitt publicly acknowledged the agency's role in the internment, and in 2007, Anderson and Seltzer published documentation of at least one instance in 1943 in which the Bureau supplied the actual names and addresses of individuals of Japanese ancestry in the Washington, D.C. area to the Secret Service, a request that originated with the Treasury Department after a reported threat against the president, fulfilled, per the surviving paperwork, within about a week. The confidentiality had been legal to breach because Congress had made it legal, and Congress quietly restored the protections in 1947 once the emergency had passed and the damage was done. That is the detail worth sitting with. The wall around your census answers is a statute, Title 13 of the United States Code, not a law of physics, and it has been lowered before, exactly once that we know of in detail, during exactly the kind of emergency in which people stop asking questions. Third case, and this one closes the circle back to the erasure we started with because it cuts the other way. Between 1893 and 1907, the Dawes Commission, chaired by former Massachusetts Senator Henry Dawes, enrolled members of the so-called 5 tribes in Indian Territory, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, onto official rolls, roughly 100,000 names in all, as the precondition for breaking up communally held tribal land into individual allotments, a process the historian Angie Dabo documented in her 1940 classic and Fissy, The Waters Runs, where the great geek horskilligist bosekusades is in the and those rolls sorted people into categories: citizens by blood, with a recorded blood quantum, a fraction assigned by a clerk at a table, often on the basis of appearance and interview, and freedmen, the formerly enslaved people of the tribes and their descendants, who were generally enrolled without any blood quantum listed, even when, as historians and tribal genealogists have extensively documented, many of them had native ancestry, sometimes from the very families seated in the by-bloodline next to them. A Clark's column choice made a century ago hardened into destiny, because those rolls became the legal basis for tribal citizenship, and blood quantum fractions descending from a stranger's estimate in 1899 still determine enrollment eligibility in some nations today. Descendants of people written onto the freedmen roll spent generations, in some cases litigating for recognition, and the Cherokee freedmen question was still being decided in federal court as recently as August of 2017, when Judge Thomas Hogan ruled in Cherokee Nation v. Nash that the freedmen's descendants hold citizenship rights under the Treaty of 1866. Black Americans with native ancestry were, in effect, filed out of one identity and into another, not by their communities, but by the ledger. The ledger giveth, and the ledger taketh away, and in every one of these 3 cases, the person holding the pen was never the person being written down. Which brings us to now, because the natural response to all this history is to assume it is history. It is not. Let me walk through what the boxes decide today, one consequence at a time. First, raw political power. The census still determines the apportionment of the House of Representatives and, through it, the Electoral College, using a mathematical formula, the method of equal proportions, that ranks every state's claim to every seat down to a decimal. After the 2020 count, Texas gained 2 seats and 5 other states gained 1 each, while 7 states lost a seat, and New York lost its seat by a margin the Census Bureau reported as 89 residents. 89 people, in a state of nearly 20 million, had 89 more New Yorkers being counted, the formula's ranking would have flipped, New York would have kept the seat, and Minnesota would have lost one. Every uncounted household is not an abstraction. It is arithmetic. Second, money. And this is the number that justifies this channel's existence. Researchers at George Washington University, in the Counting for Dollars project, led by Andrew Reamer, traced census-derived data through more than 300 federal spending programs and estimated that roughly $1.5 trillion a year in federal spending is guided by that data, flowing through Medicaid, highway planning, school lunches, Section 8 housing assistance, special education grants, and hundreds of others. The count is, functionally, the master key to the federal checkbook, which means an error in the count is not a statistical embarrassment. It is a decade-long misdirection of money because there is no recount in year 3. Third, the errors are not evenly distributed. The Census Bureau's own post-enumeration survey for 2020 estimated that the black population was undercounted by roughly 3.3%, the Hispanic population by close to 5%, more than triple its 2010 undercount, and American Indians living on reservations by about 5.6%, the worst rate of any group, while the white non-Hispanic population was overcounted by more than 1.5%. Children under 5 were missed at high rates too, and a preschooler missed in 2020 will be in high school before the ledger corrects itself. Those are the Bureau's own published figures, and if you have followed everything up to this point, you already understand what an undercount means. Fewer seats, fewer dollars, less weight on the scale, compounding for 10 years, landing hardest on precisely the communities the ledger has historically counted worst. Fourth, the boxes themselves are still moving. In 2000, for the first time, Americans could check more than one race, and about 6.8 million people immediately did. By 2020, the multiracial count had exploded past 33 million, driven partly by demographic change and partly by changes in how the Bureau processed write-in answers, which tells you the category is measuring the instrument as much as the population. In March of 2024, the Office of Management and Budget, the agency that has controlled the official racial categories since its Statistical Policy Directive 15 in 1977, announced the first major revision since 1997, combining the race and ethnicity questions into one and adding a Middle Eastern and North African category, which means that several million Americans of Lebanese, Egyptian, Iranian and other descent, people who had been statistically classified as white for generations under a definition back to early 20th century. Whatever you think of any particular change, notice the underlying fact. The categories are drafted, debated and revised by administrative process through Federal Register notices and interagency working groups, which is simply the polite, modern version of what this entire episode has been about. Fifth, and finally, the pen has changed hands partially. Since 1960, you have named yourself, and that is a genuine transfer of power from the enumerator's eye to your own hand. But you still choose from a menu you did not write, drafted upstream by an office most Americans have never heard of, and when millions of people reject the menu entirely, the system simply routes around them, which is how some other race, a category that was never meant to be an answer at all, became the second largest race category in America in 2020. The history says the menu tracks politics, diplomacy, and money at least as faithfully as it tracks people. Before the close, one more thing, and it is something you can actually do rather than merely know. Census records are sealed for 72 years, a rule with its own tangled history, formalized in a 1952 agreement between the Census Bureau and the National Archives, which means the full 1950 census was released to the public in April of 2022, all 6.4 million pages of it, digitized, indexed by handwriting recognition software, and searchable for free through the National Archives. If your family was in this country in 1950 or 1940 or 1880, you can pull the actual page and read what an enumerator wrote about them, in pen, in a stranger's handwriting, though if you go looking for 1890 you will find almost nothing, because that is the census the fire took. And here is the caveat that makes this more than genealogical tourism. Do not be surprised if what you find contradicts what your family says about itself. A grandmother recorded under a race she never claimed, a surname respelled by an enumerator who did not care to ask twice, an entire household compressed into a category. That discrepancy is not an error in your family's memory. In many cases, it is the fingerprint of everything this episode has described, the moment the ledger overwrote the person, preserved in the one place the ledger cannot revise, its own archive. So pull back and look at the whole picture one last time. The Constitution's actual instruction is startlingly plain, an enumeration of persons every 10 years. Persons. The 3/5 ratio, the mulatto column, the quadroon doorstep assessments, the one-drop instruction, the one-decade Mexican category, Plecker's surname lists, the Dawes rolls, the 1942 DAR transfers. None of that is in the founding instruction. all of it was added, decade by decade, by people who understood that whoever defines the categories controls the count, and whoever controls the count controls the seats and the money that flow from it. The census did not merely record who counted as an American. Again and again, it decided, quietly, in the space between a question and the box, and the deciding is not finished, because the 2030 form is being drafted right now by committees in offices the way it always has been. The next time that form arrives at your door, you will read it differently. You will see the boxes for what they are, not facts of nature, but the current draft of a very old negotiation. And you will know that the most consequential document in American political life is not a speech or a ruling. It is a ledger. If this changed the way you look at a government form, subscribe to the channel, because this is what we do here. We take the systems you were told are eternal, and we find the date they were invented. Give the video a like so it reaches one more person who has never asked who wrote their boxes, and if someone in your family keeps the old records, send them this one. I will see you in the next episode.